When the billionaire walked through his front door that night, the first thing he saw was blood on the marble floor, and standing in the middle of it, panting and wild-eyed, was the family dog, and in that moment, everything inside him turned to ice because his children were somewhere in this house, somewhere in this massive, silent mansion, and all he could think was, "What have you done? What have you done to my kids?" And he screamed their names so loud his voice cracked. And when they came running down the stairs crying and shaking, he grabbed them and pulled them close, and then he turned to that dog with a rage he had never felt before, because he believed with every fiber of his being that this animal had hurt his babies, and what he did next would haunt him for the rest of his life. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning, back to a morning that started like any other in the Morrison household, a household that most people would dream of living in, a 40,000 square foot estate with more rooms than anyone could count, with gardens that stretched for acres, with staff that came and went like ghosts, and at the center of it all was Richard Morrison, a man whose name was synonymous with power and wealth, a man who had built an empire from nothing and now sat at the top of it like a king. But here's the thing about kings, they're never really home, and Richard was no exception, because his days were filled with meetings that bled into dinners that turned into late-night calls with investors across the world, and somewhere in the chaos of building his fortune, he had convinced himself that providing for his children meant giving them things, the best schools, the best clothes, the biggest house money could buy, but what he couldn't seem to give them was the one thing they wanted most, which was simply him. And so his two kids, 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Lucas, had learned to fill the silence of that enormous mansion with each other, and with one other loyal soul who never left their side, a 3-year-old German shepherd named Atlas. And Atlas wasn't just a pet, he was their protector, their playmate, their shadow, the one who slept outside their bedroom doors every single night, the one who followed them from room to room like he was personally responsible for their safety, and maybe he believed he was, because from the day he was brought into that home as a puppy, he had attached himself to those children like they were his whole world, and in many ways, they were. Now, on this particular Friday evening, Richard had a problem, because his housekeeper had called in sick, his nanny had a family emergency, and he had a dinner meeting that could not be rescheduled, a meeting that was worth millions, and he stood in the foyer of his mansion looking at his two kids and convincing himself that they would be fine, that it was just 2 hours, maybe 3 at the most, that Emma was responsible for her age, that the security system was state-of-the-art, that Atlas was there, and what could possibly go wrong in a house this safe? And so he kissed them both on the forehead and told them to stay in the living room and watch a movie, and he promised he would be back before they knew it, and then he walked out the door and drove away, and the moment his taillights disappeared down the long driveway, the house felt bigger, emptier, and Emma tried to be brave for her little brother, she really did, but there was something about the way the shadows stretched across the walls that made her heart beat a little faster, and Lucas kept asking when Daddy was coming back, and she didn't have a good answer, so she just held his hand and turned up the volume on the TV, and Atlas, sensing their unease, pressed his warm body against the couch where they sat, his ears alert, his eyes scanning the room, and for a while, everything was okay. For a while, the only sounds were the cartoon playing on the screen and the occasional creak of the old house settling. But then, about an hour after their father left, something changed, and it started small, so small that the children didn't even notice it at first, just a faint smell, something sharp and chemical, drifting in from somewhere deeper in the house. But Atlas noticed, his nose twitched, his head lifted, and a low growl rumbled in his throat, and Emma looked at him and asked, "What's wrong, boy?" But he didn't look at her, he just kept staring toward the hallway that led to the east wing of the mansion. And then he stood up, his body rigid, and he started to bark. Not the playful bark the kids were used to, but something urgent, something desperate, and Emma felt fear creep up her spine because she had never seen Atlas act like this before, and she told him to stop, to be quiet, but he wouldn't, he just kept barking, and then he took off running toward the hallway, and Emma yelled for him to come back, but he was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the house, and now Lucas was crying, and Emma didn't know what to do, so she grabbed her brother's hand and they stayed frozen on that couch, listening to Atlas bark somewhere deep in the mansion, and that's when she saw it, a thin wisp of grey smoke curling under the door at the end of the hall, and her blood ran cold because she knew what smoke meant, and suddenly Atlas was back, and he was frantic, running in circles, barking at them, grabbing at Emma's sleeve with his teeth, pulling at her, and she screamed at him to stop because she didn't understand what he was doing. She thought he had lost his mind, and Lucas was sobbing now, terrified of the dog's wild behavior, and Emma tried to push Atlas away but he wouldn't go. He kept pulling at her, kept barking, and then he ran to the front door and scratched at it so hard that his claws left deep gouges in the wood, and Emma was so confused, so scared, because she couldn't connect what he was doing to what was happening, and the smoke was getting thicker now. She could see it creeping down the hallway like a living thing, and finally, something clicked in her brain, and she grabbed Lucas and ran to the front door. But when she tried to open it, she realized the security system had locked it automatically when her father left, and she didn't know the code. She was 8 years old and her father had never told her the code, and panic set in so hard she could barely breathe, and Atlas was going absolutely wild now, throwing his body against the door, barking so loud the sound echoed through the whole house. And then he did something that would change everything. He ran back toward the smoke, back toward the danger, and Emma screamed for him to stop but he was gone, and she didn't know it then, but Atlas had remembered something. He had remembered that the glass door in the sunroom on the east side of the house was thinner than the heavy oak of the front door, and he had seen birds fly into it before, had seen it crack. And so he ran straight into the heart of the smoke, his eyes burning, his lungs filling with poison, and he threw himself against that glass door with every ounce of strength in his body, and it shattered, and he landed on the other side covered in cuts, bleeding from his face, his paws, his side, but he didn't stop. He ran back through the house, back through the smoke that was now billowing thick and black from a faulty wire in the east wing that had sparked and caught fire in a storage room, and he found the children huddled by the front door, coughing, crying, and he grabbed Emma's sleeve again and he pulled, and this time she followed him through the smoke, through the chaos, through the house she thought she knew, and he led them to that broken glass door, and he went through first to show them it was safe, his paws leaving bloody prints on the patio stones, and the children climbed through after him, and they ran across the lawn, and they collapsed in the grass far from the house, coughing and gasping, and Atlas stood over them, his body trembling, blood dripping from a dozen wounds, but his eyes never left them, not once. Not even when the pain made his legs shake so bad he could barely stand. And that's when Richard Morrison pulled into the driveway, because he had forgotten his phone, just a simple mistake, a turn of fate, and he saw the smoke pouring from his house and his heart stopped, and he slammed the car into park and ran faster than he had ever run in his life, and he found his children on the lawn, covered in soot, crying, and relief flooded through him so hard he almost collapsed, but then he saw Atlas, standing there covered in blood, panting, wild-eyed, and his mind, already spinning with fear and adrenaline, made a terrible connection, because all he could see was an aggressive dog covered in blood standing over his traumatized children, and he didn't think, he just reacted, and he grabbed Atlas by the collar and he dragged him away, screaming at him, calling him a monster, and the children were trying to tell him something but he couldn't hear them over the roar of his own terror, and he threw Atlas into the garden shed at the edge of the property and he slammed the door shut, and his hands were shaking so bad he could barely lock it, and then he ran back to his children and held them and called 911, and the fire trucks came, and the ambulances came, and the whole night became a blur of sirens and questions and the realization that his home, his fortress, had almost killed his kids, and through all of it, he didn't once think about the dog locked in that shed, bleeding, alone, having just saved the only 2 people in the world he loved. The next morning, Richard sat in a hotel room with his children, and they were safe, and the doctors had said they would be fine, just some minor smoke inhalation, and he should have been relieved, and part of him was, but there was something eating at him, something in the way Emma kept asking about Atlas, something in the way Lucas cried every time he mentioned the dog's name, and Emma tried to tell him what happened. She tried to explain that Atlas had saved them, that he had broken the glass, that he had led them out, but Richard didn't want to hear it. He had already made up his mind, he had already convinced himself that the dog had been part of the problem, not the solution, because it was easier than admitting he had made a mistake, easier than facing the guilt of what he had done, and so he told Emma to stop, told her that Atlas was dangerous, told her that he would find the dog a new home, somewhere far away. And Emma cried herself to sleep that night, and so did Lucas. And Richard sat alone in the dark wondering why doing the right thing felt so wrong. 3 days later, Richard got a call from the fire investigator, and what he heard made his blood run cold, because the investigator told him they had reviewed the security footage from the mansion, footage that had been saved to the cloud before the system went offline, and the investigator told him he needed to see it, and Richard drove to the station alone, and he sat in a small room and he watched, and what he saw destroyed him, because there on the screen was Atlas, not attacking his children, not terrorizing them, but desperately trying to save them. He watched Atlas bark and pull at Emma's sleeve, he watched Atlas run toward the smoke and disappear, he watched Atlas throw himself through that glass door, watched him land in a heap of broken glass and struggle to his feet, watched him run back into the smoke-filled house covered in blood, watched him lead those children to safety, watched him stand guard over them on the lawn, trembling, bleeding, refusing to leave there. Sighed even as his body failed him, and Richard Morrison, billionaire, empire builder, powerful man who controlled boardrooms and crushed competitors, sat in that chair and broke. He broke completely, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with sobs, because he had taken that dog, that hero, that guardian angel, and he had thrown him away like garbage. He had called him a monster when he was a savior, and the guilt was so heavy he didn't know how to carry it. Richard drove back to the mansion that afternoon, or what was left of it, and he walked to the garden shed with his heart in his throat, and when he opened the door, his worst fear was realized, because Atlas was gone, the lock had rusted in the rain that had come the night before, and the door had swung open, and the dog had disappeared, and Richard fell to his knees in the mud and he screamed at himself, at his stupidity, at his arrogance, because he had spent his whole life building wealth and success and he couldn't even see what was right in front of him. He couldn't see that loyalty and love had been standing right there, bleeding for his children, and he had thrown it away. For 2 weeks, Richard searched, he hired people, he put up flyers, he walked the streets himself calling Atlas's name until his voice gave out, and his children barely spoke to him, and he didn't blame them, and every night he lay awake thinking about that dog alone somewhere, hurt, abandoned by the one person who should have protected him, and then, on a cold Tuesday morning, Richard got a call from a local veterinarian, and the voice on the other end said they had found a German shepherd matching Atlas's description, and Richard was in his car before the phone call even ended, and when he walked into that clinic and saw Atlas lying on a table, thin and weak but alive, his heart shattered all over again, and he walked over to that dog and he fell to his knees and he buried his face in Atlas's fur and he said, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't understand, I didn't see." And Atlas, this dog who had every reason to hate him, every reason to turn away, just lifted his head and licked Richard's face, and that was it. That was forgiveness, pure and simple, no conditions, no grudges, just love, the kind of love that humans spend their whole lives searching for and rarely find. Richard brought Atlas home to the hotel that day, and when Emma and Lucas saw him, they ran to him screaming his name, and Atlas's tail wagged so hard his whole body shook, and they wrapped their arms around him and promised they would never let anyone hurt him again, and Richard stood there watching, and he understood something he had never understood before, that all the money in the world couldn't buy what Atlas had given freely, that all his power meant nothing compared to the power of showing up, of being present, of protecting the people you love not with walls and security systems but with your actual presence, your actual heart, and from that day forward, things changed, not perfectly, not overnight, but they changed. Richard started coming home earlier, he started saying no to meetings, he started sitting on the floor with his kids and their dog, and Atlas slept at the foot of his bed now, a permanent reminder of what real loyalty looked like, of what he almost lost, of what he would never take for granted again. And so I'll leave you with this, because stories like this one aren't just about dogs, they're about us, about how quick we are to judge, how slow we are to understand, how often we push away the very things that are trying to save us, and maybe that's the question worth asking yourself today, not whether Atlas deserved forgiveness, because of course he did, he was never the one who needed forgiving, but whether there's someone in your life, human or otherwise, whose loyalty you've overlooked, whose love you've taken for granted, whose sacrifice you've failed to see. And if this story made you hold your own pet a little tighter, or think about the ones who show up for you even when it's hard, then share it with someone who needs to hear it, share it with someone who believes that dogs are more than pets, they're family, and leave a comment telling me what you think. Would you have been able to forgive yourself the way Richard eventually did, or would the guilt have been too much to bear? Because I think about that a lot, I think about how heavy it must be to live with a mistake like that, and I think the only thing harder than making it would be refusing to learn from it.